I am Sarah Thompson, 28 years old, and until last month, my family thought my Army career was a waste of potential. My Harvard-bound siblings mocked my uniform, while my parents conveniently forgot to display my service photo. They ignored the medals I earned in Afghanistan, calling my choice a disappointment. Little did they know that in 24 hours, the President of the United States would stand, salute me, and change everything. Before I share how the Commander-in-Chief made my family finally see my worth, drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from and hit subscribe if you have ever had your accomplishments dismissed by the people who should have been your biggest supporters. Growing up in Springfield, a small Midwestern town where everyone knew everyone, I always felt like the odd one out in my own family. My parents, Robert and Eleanor Thompson, were both educators who placed tremendous value on academic achievement above all else. My father taught physics at the local high school, while my mother was the principal at the neighboring county school. From an early age, the Thompson children were expected to excel academically, participate in enriching extracurricular activities, and ultimately attend prestigious universities. My older brother Michael was the golden child. With his perfect grades and scientific aptitude, he followed the path my parents had dreamed of. He graduated top of his class, attended Johns Hopkins Medical School, and was now a respected neurologist at one of the top hospitals in Baltimore. Family gatherings always included updates on the groundbreaking research he was conducting or the important patients he was treating. Then there was my sister Amanda, only 2 years older than me, but worlds apart in terms of how our family valued our choices. Amanda graduated from Yale Law School and secured a position at a major corporate law firm in New York. Her 6-figure salary and corner office in Manhattan were frequent topics of dinner conversation. My parents beamed with pride whenever they spoke about how she was on track to make partner before 35. And then there was me. While I maintained decent grades, I never felt the same passion for academics that seemed to come naturally to my siblings. Instead, I found myself drawn to physical challenges, teamwork activities, and, most notably, a deep sense of duty to something bigger than myself. While Michael dissected frogs in advanced biology, I was organizing community cleanups. While Amanda was winning debate tournaments, I was training for cross-country and learning wilderness survival skills with the local adventure club. My parents viewed these interests as nice hobbies, but made it clear they were not viable paths for my future. Every career aptitude test I brought home that suggested military service, law enforcement, or emergency response was met with dismissive comments. "That is just for people who cannot get into college, Sarah." When senior year came around, the pressure intensified. College applications, SAT prep, and constant comparisons to my siblings dominated every conversation, but something inside me resisted. I found myself researching military service, speaking with recruiters, and imagining a life where my natural strengths could be valued rather than dismissed. The night I announced my decision to enlist in the Army after graduation remains vivid in my memory. We were having our traditional Sunday dinner, and both my siblings happened to be home visiting. "I have made a decision about my future," I said, heart-pounding but voice steady. The table fell silent, expectant looks on every face. "I have enlisted in the United States Army. I ship out for basic training 3 weeks after graduation." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother set down her fork with a clatter. My father removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture I knew signaled deep disappointment. Michael looked genuinely confused, as if he could not comprehend why anyone would make such a choice. Amanda laughed outright. "You cannot be serious," she said. "That is for people who have no other options." "The military is a respectable career," my father finally said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But Sarah, this feels like you are giving up before you have even tried. At least apply to some state schools. You could always fall back on the Army if nothing else works out." That was the moment I understood that in my family's eyes my choice was not just different, it was lesser, a backup plan. A fallback option for those who could not succeed in the real world of academia and corporate achievement. Despite their disapproval, I held firm. 3 weeks after receiving my high school diploma, while my classmates prepared for college orientations, I boarded a bus to basic training. My parents drove me to the station, their goodbye stiff and formal. no proud photos, no tears of mixed emotion that other recruits' families displayed. Just a quick hug and a reminder to reconsider college after your first year of service. Basic training was everything I had expected and more. Physically demanding, mentally challenging, and exactly where I felt I belonged for the first time in my life. The structure, the purpose, the camaraderie, all filled a need I had always felt, but never been able to articulate to my achievement-oriented family. When I graduated from basic training, I invited my family. Only my mother came, her presence more obligatory than supportive. As other families cheered and took photos with their newly minted soldiers, my mother asked when I would be done playing soldier and ready to get on with real life. That pattern continued through my early military career. Each milestone, each achievement, each step forward in my service was met with minimal interest or outright dismissal from my family. Care packages were rare. Phone calls brief and centered around when I might leave the service rather than what I was accomplishing within it. Meanwhile, I was finding purpose, excelling in my training, and developing skills that saved lives. But to my family, none of that compared to Michael saving lives in an operating room or Amanda winning cases in a courtroom. My form of service, my type of achievement, simply did not register on their scale of success. Despite my family's lack of support, I threw myself into my military career with everything I had. The Army became the place where my natural abilities were not just acknowledged but valued and developed. My physical endurance, quick decision-making under pressure, and ability to build trust within a team quickly set me apart from many of my peers. After completing my initial training, I was assigned to an infantry support position. Though women were not yet officially allowed in combat roles when I first enlisted, the reality of modern warfare meant that the lines between combat and non-combat positions were often blurred, especially in places like Afghanistan, where I was first deployed. It was during that first deployment that I met Rebecca Martinez and Jessica Coleman, two women who would become closer to me than anyone in my biological family. Rebecca was a communications specialist from Texas, with a wicked sense of humor that kept our spirits up during the darkest days. Jessica was a medic from California, whose steady hands and calming presence made everyone feel safer just having her nearby. The three of us were assigned to the same forward operating base, a remote outpost that saw frequent action. Living conditions were basic at best, brutal at worst. Temperatures soared above 110 degrees during the day and plummeted at night. Dust got into everything. Water for anything beyond drinking was a luxury, and the constant threat of attack meant that true rest was rare. But in those harsh conditions, I discovered strengths I never knew I had. I learned I could function on minimal sleep for days when necessary. I found I had a natural talent for tactical planning that my commanding officers quickly recognized and utilized. And I developed an almost sixth sense for danger that more than once helped keep my unit safe. After 18 months and that first tour of duty, I returned home briefly. My family organized a small welcome home dinner, which on the surface seemed supportive. But the conversation quickly turned to my next steps and when I would be transitioning to civilian life, rather than any interest in what I had actually experienced or accomplished. The GI Bill would cover most of your college expenses, my father pointed out repeatedly. You could start classes next semester. What they failed to understand was that I had found my calling. I was not marking time in the military until something better came along. I was building a career I was proud of, developing skills that mattered, and making a difference in ways that felt deeply meaningful to me. I returned for a second deployment this time, having been selected for advanced training and assigned to a more specialized unit that worked closely with local communities while also conducting critical security operations. The work was dangerous but deeply fulfilling, allowing me to combine tactical skills with humanitarian efforts. It was during this deployment in my third year of service that everything changed. Our unit was coordinating security for a school opening in a village that had been under Taliban control until recently. Intelligence reports indicated minimal threat as most opposing forces had moved out of the area weeks earlier. The opening ceremony was nearly complete when the first shots rang out. What we had thought would be a routine mission turned into an ambush situation with civilians, including dozens of children caught in the crossfire. What happened next would later be described in my citation, but in the moment there was no time to think about recognition or medals. There was only action and reaction training taking over when conscious thought was a luxury we could not afford. When one of our vehicles was hit and 3 team members were injured, including Jessica, I found myself taking command of a chaotic situation. Using the school's layout that I had memorized during security planning, I coordinated an evacuation route for the civilians while organizing a defensive position with our limited personnel. Rebecca was manning communications, calling for backup and medical evacuation for the wounded. I split our remaining forces, sending half to secure the evacuation route while taking a small team to create a diversion that would draw fire away from the fleeing civilians. The plan worked, but not without cost. As we moved to rejoin the main group after ensuring the civilians were clear, a secondary explosion caught us in the open. I remember a blinding flash, a moment of absolute silence, and then nothing but pain and darkness. I woke up 4 days later in a military hospital in Germany. Rebecca was at my bedside, her arm in a sling but otherwise intact. Through her, I learned what had happened after I lost consciousness. How the rest of my team had made it to safety because of the route we had taken. How all but 2 of the civilians had survived. How the quick thinking and decisive action in those first crucial minutes had prevented what could have been a massacre. I also learned that Jessica had not made it. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, her injuries had been too severe. The loss hit me harder than my own physical injuries, a pain that went beyond the shrapnel wounds and broken bones that would keep me in recovery for months. During those long months of physical therapy and recovery, my military family surrounded me with support. Fellow soldiers visited. My commanding officers checked in regularly. Rebecca barely left my side when she could get leave. My biological family sent cards and called occasionally, but their questions always centered around when I would be coming home for good now that I had been hurt playing soldier, as my sister once tactlessly put it during a phone call. They could not seem to grasp that despite the trauma, despite the loss, despite the physical pain of recovery, I had never felt more certain that I was exactly where I was meant to be doing, exactly what I was meant to do. When I was finally awarded a Silver Star for my actions that day, along with a Purple Heart for my injuries, the ceremony was attended by my unit members, my commanding officers, and fellow soldiers I had served with. My family sent a generic congratulations card that misspelled the name of the medal and included a brochure for a college program for veterans transitioning to real careers. Their dismissal of my accomplishments hurt, but by then I had come to accept that they might never understand or value the path I had chosen. I had found validation in the respect of those who truly understood the significance of what we did, the sacrifices we made, and the importance of the work itself regardless of recognition. After nearly 7 years of active service and following my recovery from injuries sustained in that fateful mission, I made the difficult decision to transition to civilian life. It was not the result of my family's persistent pressure, but rather a personal choice based on my desire to find new ways to serve while healing both physically and emotionally from what I had experienced. I returned to my hometown temporarily, planning to use it as a base, while I explored options for my next chapter. Perhaps naively, I hoped that my family might finally have developed some understanding or respect for my service now that I had completed it with honors and distinction. I rented a small apartment on the edge of town, unwilling to move back into my parents' home despite their offer. I needed my own space, my own sanctuary, where I could process the transition from military to civilian life at my own pace. The first family dinner after my return set the tone for what was to come. My parents had invited Michael and Amanda both home for the weekend, ostensibly to welcome me back. It should have been a warm reunion. Instead, it became yet another exercise in comparing achievements and dismissing mine. Michael dominated the conversation with stories about a challenging diagnosis he had recently made saving a patient that other doctors had given up on. Amanda detailed her latest courtroom victory, securing millions for her corporate client. My parents beamed with pride, asking detailed questions and hanging on every word. When there was finally a lull, My mother turned to me with what seemed like an afterthought. "And what about you, Sarah? Have you started looking for jobs yet? Or perhaps considered enrolling in some classes for the fall semester?" I took a breath before answering. "I am exploring my options. The transition program has some good resources for veterans, and I have been networking with other former service members who have established civilian careers." "That is nice, dear," my father said dismissively, "but you really should not wait too long. Gaps in employment do not look good on resumes. Perhaps we could set you up with an entry-level position at the school district office. Something to tide you over until you figure things out." The implication was clear. In their eyes, my 7 years of military service, including combat deployment leadership experience and commendations, counted for nothing in the real world. It was a gap to be explained away rather than an achievement to be highlighted. "Actually," I said, trying to keep my voice-level, military experience is highly valued in many fields. Leadership crisis, management logistics, teamwork under pressure, these are all transferable skills." Michael chuckled. "Come on, Sarah. Shooting guns and following orders is hardly comparable to professional experience. You will essentially be starting from scratch, and you are already behind people your age who went to college." I felt my jaw tighten. I led teams in life-or-death situations. I coordinated complex operations with multiple moving parts. I made decisions that saved lives. That is not shooting guns and following orders, Michael. "Well, we are just concerned," Amanda interjected with a patronizing smile. "The job market is competitive, and you do not exactly have the credentials employers are looking for." "I have medals the military gives for exemplary service and saving lives," I responded, my frustration building. "Oh, those little pins," my sister said with a dismissive wave. "I am sure those will impress at job interviews." The conversation moved on, but something had shifted inside me. I realized that no matter what I had accomplished, no matter what I had endured, my family would never see my service as valuable or worthy of respect. Their metrics for success were so narrow, so rigidly defined, that my achievements would always be invisible to them. In the weeks that followed, I found myself minimizing my military experience when around my family. I kept my medals in their cases rather than displaying them in my apartment. I avoided mentioning the nightmares that sometimes still woke me, the phantom pain from healed wounds, or the grief that occasionally overwhelmed me when something triggered memories of Jessica or others I had lost. Instead, I channeled my energy into rebuilding a civilian life. I began volunteering at the local Veterans Center, finding solace in the company of others who understood without explanation. I explored job opportunities that would utilize my skills and experience, though many were in other cities far from my hometown. It was during one of my volunteer shifts that I reconnected with Heather Davis, a childhood friend I had lost touch with over the years. She had come to the center to drop off donations and recognized me immediately. "Sarah Thompson, I heard you were back in town," she exclaimed, giving me a warm hug. "You look great, different, stronger somehow." Over coffee after my shift, Heather asked questions no one in my family ever had. She wanted to know about my experiences, my role, the places I had been. Not out of morbid curiosity, but from a genuine interest in understanding that part of my life. When I hesitantly mentioned some of my commendations, her reaction was refreshingly different from my family's. "A Silver Star, Sarah, that is one of the highest honors. You must have done something incredible," she said, her expression showing genuine awe and respect. For the first time since returning home, I found myself talking openly about my service, not the sanitized version I offered my family, but the complex reality of it, the pride and the pain, the accomplishments and the costs. Heather listened without judgment, asked thoughtful questions, and by the end of our conversation, I felt more seen and understood than I had in months of being around my own family. Our coffee meetup became a regular thing, a bright spot in the otherwise strained experience of being back in my hometown. Through Heather, I began rebuilding a social circle of people who accepted me as I was, not as they thought I should be. It was during this period of gradual adjustment to civilian life that an official-looking envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside was an invitation to a special recognition ceremony in Washington, D.C., honoring members of my unit and others who had served in the same operation. The president himself would be presenting commendations and speaking about the significance of our actions, much of which had remained classified until recently. My first instinct was to RSVP for myself, only knowing my family would show little interest. But during Sunday dinner that weekend, when I mentioned I would be away for a few days the following month, my mother pressed for details. "I have been invited to a ceremony in Washington," I said vaguely. "Something for veterans." "Washington, D.C., Amanda perked up. "During cherry blossom season. That sounds lovely. What kind of ceremony?" Reluctantly, I explained the nature of the event, downplaying its significance out of habit. To my surprise, my father said, "Well, we should all go. Make a family trip of it. It has been years since we visited the capital." My stomach knotted at the thought of my family treating a solemn military recognition as a tourist opportunity, but a small part of me also yearned for them to witness something that might finally make them understand. Perhaps seeing the ceremony, hearing the president speak about our service, would help them see what I had never been able to make them understand through my own words. "All right," I agreed cautiously. "I will let you know the details." As the date approached, I found myself increasingly anxious about my family's presence. Would they embarrass me with inappropriate comments? Would they remain dismissive even in that setting? Or was there a chance, however small, that this experience might finally bridge the gap between us? The weeks leading up to the Washington ceremony were filled with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The official communication had provided more details about the event, explaining that it would honor specific operations that had previously been classified but were now being acknowledged publicly for their strategic importance and the exceptional service of those involved. My name was specifically mentioned along with others from my unit as recipients of special recognition from the president himself. Under different circumstances, this would have been a moment of pure pride. Instead, I found myself worrying about how my family would behave, what dismissive comments they might make, and whether they would embarrass me in front of people who actually understood the significance of what we had done. Shopping for appropriate attire became yet another exercise in frustration. My mother insisted on accompanying me, treating the whole thing like some sort of social event rather than a solemn military ceremony. "You should wear something colorful, Sarah," she suggested as we browsed a department store. "All those military events are so drab with everyone in uniform." "Mom, I will be wearing my dress uniform," I explained for what felt like the 100th time. "That is what is appropriate for this type of ceremony." She sighed dramatically. "Well, at least get your hair done properly, and maybe some makeup would help. You always look so severe in that uniform." I bit back the retort that rose to my lips, reminding myself that in just a few days, this would all be over. One way or another, the ceremony would happen, and I would get through it with or without my family's understanding. As the departure date approached, my parents and siblings ramped up their Washington tourism plans, discussing museums, restaurants, and sightseeing opportunities, as if the ceremony that was the entire reason for our trip was merely an inconvenient obligation in an otherwise fun vacation. "We should try to fit in the National Gallery before the ceremony," my father suggested as we finalized plans, "and perhaps the Air and Space Museum the day after." "The ceremony will likely take most of the day," I reminded him, "and there is usually a reception afterward." "Well, surely they do not expect everyone to stay for the whole thing," Amanda said dismissively. "We can slip out early if it drags on." I closed my eyes, briefly summoning patience. "This is not a movie premiere or a charity gala, Amanda. It is a formal military recognition ceremony with the President of the United States. No, we cannot slip out early." The morning we left for Washington, I seriously considered calling my family and telling them not to come. The only thing that stopped me was a stubborn, perhaps naive hope that seeing the ceremony, hearing about what we had done from someone with the stature of the commander-in-chief, might finally make them understand what my words alone never could. We flew to Washington and checked into our hotel, where my family immediately began planning their sightseeing schedule, barely acknowledging that we were there for a specific purpose. That evening, I made an excuse about needing to check in with event organizers and escaped to meet Rebecca and Jessica's family, who had also been invited to the ceremony. Seeing Rebecca again was like taking a full breath after months of shallow breathing. We embraced tightly, both of us understanding without words what this recognition meant, and the bittersweet nature of it without Jessica. "Your family come with you?" Rebecca asked as we settled at a quiet corner table in the hotel bar. I nodded, unable to keep the grimace from my face. "They are upstairs planning which museums to visit before and after suffering through the boring ceremony," as my sister put it. Rebecca's expression darkened. "After all this time, they still do not get it, do they?" "They never have," I admitted. Part of me hoped this might change things, but now I am just worried they will say or do something embarrassing tomorrow. "Screw them," Rebecca said bluntly. "Tomorrow is not about them. It is about us, about Jessica, about everyone who was there that day and what we did. Do not let their ignorance dim that for you." Jessica's parents joined us a little later, greeting me with the warmth and pride my own parents had never shown for my service. Mrs. Coleman held my hands tightly in hers. "Jessica always spoke so highly of you in her letters," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "She said you were the best leader she ever served under. Fearless but never reckless with the lives of your team." That simple statement, that recognition of what mattered most to me as a leader, meant more than any formal commendation ever could. I fought back tears as I thanked her, wishing desperately that Jessica could be here herself. When I finally returned to my family's suite later that evening, they were gathered around the coffee table with tourist maps and brochures spread out before them. "There you are," my mother said. "We were just deciding whether to visit Arlington before or after your ceremony. What do you think?" Something in me snapped. "I think that tomorrow is not a sightseeing opportunity for you to plan around. I think that maybe just once you could treat my military service with a fraction of the respect you give to Michael's medical career or Amanda's legal accomplishments. I think that tomorrow the President of the United States is going to speak about something I was part of, something that mattered, and all you can think about is how to fit in a visit to Arlington National Cemetery like it is just another tourist attraction, rather than the final resting place of people who died serving this country, including friends of mine." A stunned silence followed my outburst. My father removed his glasses, that familiar gesture of disappointment. "There is no need for dramatics, Sarah. Of course we understand tomorrow is important to you." "To me," I echoed incredulously. "Do you think this is some kind of personal vanity project? This ceremony is recognizing actions that saved lives, operations that protected our national security. It is not important to me. It is important, period." Michael raised his hands in a placating gesture. "All right, we get it. Big military thing tomorrow. Very serious. We will be on our best behavior, I promise." His condescending tone only fueled my frustration, but I was too exhausted to continue the argument. "I am going to bed. The ceremony starts at 10. We need to be there by 9:30. Please be ready on time." As I closed the door to my separate room, I heard my sister's voice. I have never seen her so worked up about playing soldier. I pressed my forehead against the cool door, wondering for the 1,000th time why I had thought bringing them was a good idea. Morning arrived with a clear sky and a knot of anxiety in my stomach. I rose early, taking extra care with my appearance as I prepared to don my dress uniform. Each medal, each insignia had to be perfectly placed, not out of vanity, but out of respect for what they represented and the occasion itself. I had just finished pinning the silver star to my uniform when a knock came at my door. It was my mother, already dressed in a floral sundress, more suited to a garden party than a military ceremony. "Oh," she said, looking me up and down, "you really are wearing that uniform. Do not you have something more festive? This is a celebration after all." I took a deep breath. "This is not a celebration, Mom. It is a formal military recognition ceremony. And yes, my dress uniform is the only appropriate attire." She shrugged, clearly not understanding. "Well, we are all ready. Your father wants to know if we have time for breakfast before this thing starts." "You can go ahead," I said, checking my watch. "I need to be there early to check in with the organizers. I will meet you there." In truth, I needed time alone to center myself, to reconnect with the meaning of the day without my family's distractions. I arrived at the venue, a stately government building, with high columns and imposing architecture well before the designated time. Inside, military personnel and government officials were making final preparations. I spotted Rebecca across the room, resplendent in her own dress uniform, and made my way to her. "Ready for this?" she asked, straightening my already straight collar in a gesture of solidarity. "As ready as I will ever be," I replied. "My family just showed up dressed for a summer picnic, completely clueless about what today actually means." She squeezed my shoulder. "Focus on the meaning, not their ignorance. Today people will finally hear about what happened out there. Jessica's sacrifice, your leadership, all of it." She was right, of course. Whatever my family's attitude this day was about honoring service and sacrifice that had remained in the shadows for too long. The ceremony was set to take place in a grand hall with rows of chairs facing a stage where the presidential seal was prominently displayed. As more guests arrived, I was directed to a special seating area reserved for those being recognized. My family would be seated in the general audience section. When they finally arrived, my heart sank at the sight of them. They looked completely out of place among the sea of uniforms and formal attire. My father was checking his watch impatiently. My mother was fussing with her hair, and my siblings were whispering to each other, with expressions that suggested they were already bored. An usher directed them to their seats, and I forced myself to focus on the ceremony preparations rather than their obvious discomfort with the formality of the event. As 10 o'clock approached, the hall filled with distinguished guests, high-ranking military officials, government representatives, and families of service members. A military band played softly, adding to the dignified atmosphere. Precisely at 10, a voice announced the arrival of the President of the United States. Everyone rose as he entered, accompanied by military leaders and Secret Service agents. There was something undeniably powerful about his presence, a gravity that seemed to shift the energy in the room. After the national anthem and opening remarks from the Secretary of Defense, the ceremony began in earnest. The president stepped to the podium, his expression solemn but warm. "Today," he began, "we recognize actions that until recently remained classified for national security reasons. Operations that represented the very best of American military service, courage, sacrifice, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to protecting both our nation's interests and innocent civilian lives." He spoke broadly at first about the significance of the operations being recognized, providing context about the geopolitical situation at the time and why these particular missions had been so crucial. Then he began to acknowledge specific units and individuals. When he called the designation of my unit, my heart rate quickened. From my position, I could just make out my family in the audience. For the first time, they seemed to be paying full attention, perhaps finally realizing that this was not just another meaningless military ritual. "Among the most significant actions we recognize today," the president continued, "was Operation Falcon Shield, led by then Staff Sergeant Sarah Thompson." I heard my name and felt a surreal detachment, as if this was happening to someone else. The president was speaking about me, about that day that had changed everything. What was initially planned as a routine security detail for a school opening became one of the most remarkable examples of leadership under fire that I have encountered in my time as Commander-in-Chief, he said. He began to detail the events of that day, now declassified enough to be shared publicly: the ambush, the split-second decisions, the evacuation plan that saved dozens of civilian lives, including 37 children who would otherwise have been caught in the crossfire. When the initial attack occurred, Staff Sergeant Thompson took command after the unit's lieutenant was severely wounded, he explained. Despite being outnumbered and under heavy fire, she developed and executed an evacuation plan that military strategists now study as a textbook example of civilian protection during active combat. As he spoke, screens around the hall displayed maps and diagrams of the school compound, illustrating the tactical challenges and how they had been overcome. I saw my family's expressions change from polite attention to stunned realization as the full scope of what had happened became clear. Using her detailed knowledge of the compound layout, which she had memorized during security preparations, Staff Sergeant Thompson created a diversion with a small team, while simultaneously coordinating the evacuation of all civilians. Through a secondary route, the president continued. When communications were compromised, she adapted the plan on the fly, using predetermined signals to coordinate movements across her scattered team. He detailed how I had personally led the most dangerous part of the operation, drawing enemy fire away from the evacuation route, and how even after being wounded I had continued to direct my team until all civilians were safely clear. The actions of Staff Sergeant Thompson and her team that day saved the lives of 37 civilians, including 32 children and 12 fellow soldiers, he said solemnly. 3 service members lost their lives, including combat medic Jessica Coleman, who continued treating wounded civilians even under direct fire. At the mention of Jessica's name, I felt tears prick at my eyes. Rebecca, seated beside me, reached over and squeezed my hand tightly. But what makes this story even more remarkable, the president said, his voice taking on a more personal tone, are the accounts we have gathered from those who were there. A school teacher described how Staff Sergeant Thompson carried 2 injured children to safety while still coordinating her team's movements. A local interpreter recalled how she insisted on confirming every room was clear before allowing her own wounds to be treated. And her fellow soldiers describe a leader who never asked anyone to take a risk she was not willing to take herself. As he spoke, I caught sight of my family again. My mother had her hand over her mouth. My father sat completely still, his earlier impatience replaced by an expression of stunned attention. Michael and Amanda were no longer whispering to each other but staring at the stage with wide eyes. It is my deep honor, the president said, to now ask Staff Sergeant Sarah Thompson to join me on stage to receive formal recognition for her extraordinary service. I rose on legs that felt suddenly unsteady, making my way to the stage with the disciplined posture that had become second nature during my years of service. As I approached the president, I saw not just the commander-in-chief, but a person who genuinely understood the significance of what we had done that day. He shook my hand firmly before turning back to the audience. The citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty." Staff Sergeant Thompson distinguished herself by acts of gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as squad leader during combat operations against an armed enemy. With total disregard for her own safety, Staff Sergeant Thompson repeatedly exposed herself to heavy enemy fire to direct the evacuation of civilians and wounded personnel, personally engaging hostile forces to create a diversion that allowed for the successful extraction of 37 civilians and 12 military personnel. Her extraordinary heroism and selflessness above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army. He then did something unexpected. Instead of simply handing me the commendation, he stepped back and rendered a formal salute, a gesture of profound respect from the highest military authority to a lower-ranking service member. The hall erupted in applause as I returned the salute, military protocol, momentarily overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. As the applause continued, I glanced toward my family and saw something I had never seen before, genuine awe on their faces. As the applause finally subsided, I expected to return to my seat. Instead, the president gestured for me to remain on stage. He turned back to the microphone, his expression more serious than before. "What I have shared so far about Staff Sergeant Thompson's actions would be remarkable enough," he said. "But there are aspects of Operation Falcon Shield that have remained classified until very recently, details that provide an even more complete picture of the extraordinary service rendered that day." A murmur went through the audience. Even I was surprised, unsure what additional information had been declassified since my last briefing. With the recent diplomatic developments in the region, the president continued, "I am now at liberty to share that the school opening that day was not simply a routine civil affairs mission. Intelligence had confirmed that the school itself had been wired with explosives by insurgent forces who planned to detonate them during the ceremony, an act that would have been blamed on American forces to turn local opinion against our presence." This was news even to me. While we had known there were high-level security concerns around the event, the specific nature of the threat had never been fully disclosed to those of us on the ground. Staff Sergeant Thompson's unit was selected for this mission specifically because of her demonstrated ability to build rapport with local communities and her exceptional attention to detail in security planning, he explained. What we did not anticipate was that the insurgents had infiltrated the local security forces and planned a coordinated attack to coincide with the attempted bombing. He went on to reveal that my insistence on personally inspecting the school grounds repeatedly in the days before the ceremony had led to the discovery of the hidden explosives. My detailed mapping of the compound, which had later proved crucial during the evacuation, had been part of a counter-operation to neutralize the threat without alerting the insurgents. The attack that day was not simply bad luck or poor intelligence, the president said gravely. It was a desperate reaction by enemy forces who realized their primary plan had been compromised. What Staff Sergeant Thompson did not know when she led that evacuation was that her actions earlier in the week had already saved everyone in that school from a mass casualty event. The hall was completely silent now, everyone hanging on every word. Furthermore, he continued, among the 37 civilians evacuated were 3 key figures in the subsequent peace process, including 2 children who would later become powerful advocates for cooperation between local communities and coalition forces. Had they been lost that day, the diplomatic progress we have recently achieved might never have been possible. He turned to face me directly. Staff Sergeant Thompson, your actions not only saved lives in the immediate moment, but created the conditions for a peace that will save countless more in the years to come. On behalf of a grateful nation, I thank you not just for your courage under fire but for your foresight, your attention to detail, and your commitment to protecting the most vulnerable, even at great personal risk. The president then invited Jessica Coleman's parents to join us on stage, along with representatives from the village whose children had been saved. Mrs. Coleman embraced me tightly, tears streaming down her face. Jessica always said you were the best of us, she whispered. Now everyone knows it too. A village elder, speaking through an interpreter, explained how the school we had protected that day was now thriving with over 300 students. They had named their library after Jessica and dedicated a plaque thanking the American soldiers who had protected their children at the cost of their own safety. As these personal testimonials continued, I found myself overwhelmed with emotion. This was not just about medals or recognition. It was about impact, about lives touched and futures preserved. It was about the difference that service could make, not measured in academic degrees or corporate achievements, but in human terms. When I was finally able to return to my seat, Rebecca squeezed my arm. You never told me about finding those explosives, she whispered. I did not know the full story either, I admitted. Some of it was compartmentalized. I just knew we had to check everything twice. The ceremony continued with other recognitions, but I found it hard to focus. My mind kept returning to those revelations, fitting new pieces into the puzzle of what had happened that day and why it had unfolded as it had. When the formal portion of the ceremony concluded, we moved to a reception area where attendees could mingle and speak more personally with those being honored. I was immediately surrounded by military officials, government representatives, and families wanting to express their gratitude. Through the crowd, I spotted my family standing awkwardly to the side, looking shell-shocked. My father's usual confident posture was replaced by something that looked almost like humility. My mother was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Michael and Amanda stood silently, a stark contrast to their usual eloquent self-assurance. Before I could make my way to them, I was approached by a distinguished-looking man who introduced himself as a senior State Department official. Sergeant Thompson, he said earnestly, I was the regional coordinator during Operation Falcon Shield. What no one has mentioned today is that your actions also protected 3 undercover intelligence officers whose identities would have been compromised in the attack. Their continued work prevented 3 major terrorist incidents in the following year. I have waited a long time to be able to thank you personally. As he moved on, a woman in civilian clothes touched my arm gently. My son was one of the soldiers you evacuated that day, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He told me he had given up hope until he heard your voice on the radio calm and clear, telling them exactly how to get out. He said it was like you had already mapped every possible escape route in your head. One by one, people came forward with stories I had never heard, connections I had never known existed, ripple effects from actions that had seemed in the moment like nothing more than doing what needed to be done. And all the while, my family watched from the periphery, witnessing a reality they had never acknowledged: that my service, my choices, my career had mattered profoundly. Eventually, they approached me, moving hesitantly as if unsure of their welcome. My father spoke first, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Sarah, he began, then stopped, seeming at a loss for words, perhaps for the first time in his life. "We had no idea." "No," I agreed quietly. "You did not. You never asked." My mother reached for my hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "All those medals. The Silver Star. We thought they were just. I do not know what we thought, but we never imagined that I had actually done something worthy of them," I finished for her. Amanda stepped forward, her usual poise completely absent. "The President of the United States saluted you," she said, sounding bewildered. "He actually saluted you." "That is protocol when recognizing extraordinary service," I explained, not unkindly. Michael shook his head slowly. "When you said you led teams and made life or death decisions, I thought you were exaggerating, but those people just now, the things they were saying about you. They were saying that your sister is a hero," came a voice from behind me. It was Rebecca, who had approached without my noticing. "They were saying what those of us who served with her have known for years, that Sarah Thompson is one of the finest soldiers and human beings I have ever had the honor to know." My family looked taken aback by her fierce loyalty. Rebecca extended her hand to my father with military crispness. "Staff Sergeant Rebecca Martinez," she introduced herself. "I served with Sarah from our first deployment. I was there that day in the village. Everything the president said, it does not begin to cover what your daughter did for us, for those civilians, for this country." My father shook her hand automatically, looking somewhat dazed. "We are very proud of Sarah," he said, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. Rebecca gave him a measuring look. "Are you?" "Because from what Sarah has told me, that is news." Before the moment could become too uncomfortable, we were interrupted by an aide informing me that the president wished to speak with me privately before departing. As I excused myself, I heard Rebecca continuing to speak to my family, her tone direct but not unkind, filling in the gaps of understanding they had never bothered to explore themselves. The drive back to our hotel following the ceremony and reception was unlike any car ride I had ever experienced with my family. The usual chatter about schedules and plans was replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by occasional murmured observations about the grandeur of the venue or the importance of the people who had been present. It was my father who finally addressed the elephant in the room as we entered our hotel suite. "Sarah," he said, his voice lacking its usual authoritative tone, "I think we owe you an apology." I set down my cover, the formal military hat that completed my dress uniform, and turned to face them. "You do not need to apologize, Dad." "No, we do," my mother interjected, her eyes still red from crying. "We have been so dismissive of your service, so condescending, so wrong." I took a seat, suddenly feeling the emotional weight of the day. "I never needed you to understand everything about my military career. I just needed you to respect that it was my choice and that it mattered." Michael sat across from me, his usual confident demeanor subdued. "When did you find those explosives they talked about? The ones in the school?" It was the first genuine question about my service any of them had ever asked me. Not when I would be leaving the military, not how I could pivot to something better, but an actual interest in what I had actually done. 2 days before the ceremony, I replied, the memory sharp in my mind. We were doing routine sweeps, but something felt off about the construction in one of the classrooms. Newer plaster, in one section of wall, slightly different color. I insisted on bringing in explosive detection equipment, even though local officials assured us it was just recent repairs. "And that is when you found them?" Amanda asked, leaning forward with interest. I nodded. 3 separate explosive caches strategically placed to bring down the entire structure. If they had detonated during the ceremony. I did not need to finish the sentence. How did you stay so calm during the attack? My father asked. The president described decisions you made in split seconds that saved all those people. Training, I said simply. And knowing that panic would not help anyone. We practice scenarios, develop muscle memory for crisis response. When the real thing happens, you fall back on that training. For the next hour, for the first time ever, my family asked me real questions about my service. Not superficial inquiries or judgmental comments, but genuine attempts to understand what my military career had truly entailed. And for the first time, I found myself able to share with them a part of my life that had previously existed in a separate compartment, cordoned off during family interactions, to avoid their dismissal or misunderstanding. The conversation continued through dinner in the hotel restaurant, where my father asked about the training that had prepared me for leadership roles, drawing parallels to his own work developing curriculum for the school district. My mother wanted to know about the relationships I had formed, the support systems that had helped me through difficult times. Michael, with his medical background, was curious about how we handled field trauma and the coordination between combat medics and evacuation teams. And Amanda, perhaps most surprisingly, asked thoughtful questions about the rules of engagement and the legal frameworks that governed our operations. As we returned to the suite that evening, my mother hesitated at the door to my room. "Sarah, there is something I need to say," she began. "All these years we pushed you toward paths, we understood paths like your siblings took. We thought we were helping you find success, but really, we were just trying to fit you into a definition of success we recognized." Her eyes filled with tears. "Today I watched the President of the United States salute my daughter. I listened to people talk about lives saved because of your courage and quick thinking. I realized that while we were worrying about your lack of a college degree, you were out there making a difference in ways we could not even imagine." She took my hands in hers. "I am so sorry we did not see it sooner. I am so sorry we made you feel less than when all along you were doing something greater than anything we could comprehend." Her words, so long awaited, brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you, Mom. That means more than you know." The next morning, my father announced a change of plans. "I think we should visit Arlington today," he said over breakfast. "Not as tourists, but to pay proper respects. Sarah, would you be willing to tell us about some of the traditions and meanings behind the site? Help us understand it the way you do." It was a small gesture, but a meaningful one. A recognition that my perspective, my understanding, my experience had value. As we walked among the rows of white markers later that day, I shared stories of the friends I had lost, the meaning of different military honors, the significance of the eternal flame, and the changing of the guard. My family listened with a new reverence, asking thoughtful questions and taking time for silent reflection. In the days and weeks after our return home, the change in my family's attitude persisted. My father called to ask if I would be willing to speak to his high school students about leadership and service. My mother began displaying my service photo alongside Michael's medical school graduation picture and Amanda's law school portraits. My siblings, though still deeply embedded in their own career paths, made efforts to draw parallels rather than distinctions between our different forms of achievement. For my part, I finally felt able to fully integrate my military identity with my civilian life. I no longer downplayed my experiences or hid my commendations when family was present. I spoke more openly about both the pride and the challenges of service, the accomplishments and the costs. 3 months after the Washington ceremony, I made a decision about my next chapter. Drawing on both my military experience and my newfound confidence in its value, I established a veterans support program in my hometown, creating a space where returning service members could find resources, community, and understanding as they transitioned to civilian life. To my surprise, my family not only supported this venture but became actively involved. My father volunteered his organizational skills to help structure educational components. My mother, with her connections in the school district, helped create pathways for veterans to mentor at-risk youth. Michael offered to coordinate with medical providers to ensure veterans had access to quality health care. And Amanda, perhaps most surprisingly, provided pro bono legal assistance for veterans navigating benefits and housing issues. At the opening of our center's new building nearly a year after that transformative ceremony in Washington, I found myself reflecting on the journey. My father approached watching as I adjusted a display of photographs showing local veterans in both their military service and their civilian lives. "You know," he said quietly, "I spent so many years worried that you were wasting your potential. Now I realize you saw potential in a different kind of service, one I was too narrow-minded to value." I smiled at him. "We all serve in different ways, Dad. You're teaching Michael's medical work, Amanda's legal advocacy, they are all forms of service too. I think what matters is not the path we choose but the purpose behind it." He nodded thoughtfully. "The president saluted you that day. At first I was just shocked by the gesture, the formality of it, but later I realized what it really meant. It was one leader acknowledging another, recognizing that true leadership is not about titles or positions, but about taking responsibility when it matters most." His words captured something essential that had been missing in our family dynamic for so long: recognition that value and worth come in many forms, that success can be measured in lives touched rather than degrees earned or salaries commanded. The journey from being seen as worthless to being recognized for my true worth had been long and often painful. The validation from the president powerful, as it was ultimately mattered less than the understanding I had finally found with my own family. And the most important lesson I had learned along the way was that external validation, while gratifying, is secondary to knowing your own worth, to recognizing the value in your choices, and standing firmly in that knowledge regardless of others' opinions. As our center thrived and grew, becoming a cornerstone of support for veterans in our community, I often thought about that ceremony in Washington, about the president's salute and my family's transformation. But more often I thought about Jessica, about Rebecca, about all those who had served alongside me, understanding from the beginning what my family had taken so long to see: that there are many paths to a meaningful life, many ways to make a blanks by day difference, and many forms that honor and worth can take. Have you ever had your accomplishments dismissed by those who should have supported you most? Or experienced that powerful moment when someone finally recognized your true worth? Share your story in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to be reminded of their own worth today. Thank you for listening to my journey from dismissal to recognition, and remember, your worth is not determined by others' ability to see it.